Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.
We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power.
The task force, with all its power, is ready. Britain has gathered its might. It must set its course.
I'm not allowed to say how many planes joined the raid, but I counted them all out, and I counted them all back.
We're now between the two gun lines, and there's a right old artillery duel going on between them.
There is a white flag flying over Stanley. Very marvellous.
Welcome to Land, Sea and Air, Stories from the Armed Forces. In this series, we hear untold stories from the Falklands War, 40 years on. This is the story of the conflict, told by 8 different people who were actually there.
Hi, Steve. I'm really interested to listen to the next discussion in this Falklands series of yours. Chris Howe. I've actually met Chris Howe quite recently, and I was blown away by his story. So I think this discussion will be really interesting to listen to.
Yeah, he's a remarkable chap and continues to serve, I think, in my humble opinion, the community that his community. But he was, as you know, on board HMS Coventry.
Yes, HMS Coventry, D118, sunk on the 25th of May 1982. It's an unbelievable story, actually.
It is. Let's have a listen to see what he had to say. Chris, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast.
Oh, you're welcome, Steve. And it's great that we can do something like this and the whole series of podcasts to promote not only the summer 82, but the fact that 40 years ago, a massive undertaking by the UK Armed Forces was successful in repatriating the Falkland Islands from an unlawful, illegal invasion.
Indeed, it's very topical, isn't it, in this day and age with what else is going on in the world as well. So these things still threaten civilization, I think, in some ways. So you were on board HMS Coventry, and I think many of our listeners will have heard of HMS Coventry because it's unfortunately was hit during the conflict. And I just want to find out a little bit about the backstory before we talk about the actual incident. The main part of this story is, where were you when you realised you were heading, I'm going to say south, but I'm not even sure if you were north of the Falklands at the time. Where were you and when you found out about the Falklands?
Indeed, I was serving in HMS Coventry as a petty officer electronic warfare, and it was on the 2nd of April that we first found out that the Argentinian forces had invaded both Falkland Island and South Georgia illegally, unlawfully. We were in Gibraltar at the back end of a 4-week exercise spring train in the Mediterranean. We were in Gibraltar for some R&R, picking up some last-minute rabbits to take back to our families in the UK. Indeed, for me, it was for my 2 boys. Had some nice toys there to take back to them. And that's when we found out about it. It was basically 2nd of April morning. Do you hear there? Captain speaking. Earlier today, the Falkland Islands were invaded by Argentinian forces, and that's where my story in HMS Coventry D18 starts to unfold, whilst alongside in Gibraltar, 2nd of April, 1982.
So I've spoken to a few others that that served during the Falklands, and many didn't even know where it was when they were told that's where they were going. Did you have a bit of better geography than that?
My geography is quite good, actually. I'm a bit anal about reading maps the same way people read books. So I knew where the Falklands was, but indeed I did have one lad in my department actually who was looking around the top of Scotland for the Falkland Islands. So yeah, there were, and that's a common in the years that have gone by. I know lots of people would have struggled to know exactly where the Falkland Islands were, and or even the fact that the UK had a massive interest with the people of the Falkland Islands. Not so now. Everybody knows where it is now.
Yes, for obvious reasons. So it's the 40th commemorations this year. So it's quite a big event because there's going to be a national commemoration. I think that's important to recognise that. So could you just tell me a little bit about your role on board HMS Coventry and then the journey south?
Yeah, it was 1982, serving in Coventry. I was a petty officer electronic warfare, running a small department within the operations department. I also had the temporary job of intelligence officer as well. We'd lost our intelligence officer for a while. I'd gone to do some training courses. So that was my role. So within Coventry, once we knew we were going south, one of my first tasks was to try and find out as much as I could to get an intelligence picture to brief the command and the warfare officers on the Argentinian forces, the forces that theoretically we were going down to take on, actually, to repatriate the Falkland Islands. That was my first job.
So you said electronic warfare there and intelligence. Obviously, this is 1982, so I'm assuming that technology was very different back then. How did that look? How did you gather intelligence? What did that involve?
Back in 82, certainly the threat that people in my branch were trained to understand and be very knowledgeable about was the Soviet threat during the Cold War. So all the Soviet threat, we knew, encyclopedic, it was inbred in our minds, and all of a sudden we were facing potential enemy, Argentina, that we knew nothing about, other than, we knew that they purchased certain previous UK warships, ex-US ships. We knew that they had French aircraft, American aircraft, indeed the French Exocet missile system. But we had very little intelligence that, from an electronic warfare perspective, we could determine the types of radar signatures and weapon signatures that we would potentially be up against. So I had to turn to the only means I had on board, and that was open sources, using a series of books called the Jane's Defence series of books. And 40 years ago, there was only about 8, I think. Now there's probably up to over 40 titles. And that was all book. It wasn't in soft copy on a laptop that you can refer to now. So technology was different then. We did send requests up to UK, to GCHQ, but no further information was forthcoming, and nothing ever reached us.
Not only were you kind of heading into the unknown in terms of nobody knew exactly what was going to happen at this stage, but I'm guessing from what you're saying that the information was quite sketchy.
The information was almost non-existent coming from north. It was going to be self-help, and that wasn't too much of a worry in electronic warfare terms, because if the potential enemy, the Argentinians, were to transmit, we could intercept that information, analyze it, record it, and then use it for future use, for any future encounters. And that's what we were forced to do. And we could also share that information within the task group going south as well. So Coventry had electronic warfare sensors, what we call passive measures, and also the other ships with us also had similar electronic warfare capability.
By that you mean able to listen into the potential enemies' signals and intelligence and communications.
Exactly. We could listen into their radar frequencies. Indeed, communications was something else that I used to monitor from the office, mostly the HF chatter, to see what was going on, if there was any intelligence to be gained. Unfortunately, that was all in Spanish, so we had to address that and get an interpreter flown in. But we did that, and we managed to intercept some of these transmissions, which we sent north to the UK for analysis and consideration.
So at that time, as you left Gibraltar and headed south, what was the mood like on board ship?
Heading south, the mood in the ship was one of frustration that some South American country had interfered with a perfectly good run ashore in Gibraltar. And we were all looking forward to going home for Easter leave. And not just Easter leave for some of my shipmates. There were a couple of guys were going north, certainly one I remember, and probably in other ships. We were going north to get married, actually, over the Easter period. I personally had my wife was off to Amsterdam with her sisters and her mother, and that in the end it didn't happen. But morale was very good. We were all highly trained up, having just done exercise spring train, and we're all thinking, well, this can't be right. Eventually, diplomacy will see sense. The diplomats will be talking, and there'll be a solution, and we'll do a 180 and head north and not south.
There was obviously a moment when the ship's crew realised that wasn't going to be, the diplomatic solution wasn't going to be the case. So fast forwarding a bit, when did that happen? When did that sink in, do you think?
So we proceeded south. We got 2nd of April, 11th of April, we got to Ascension. We did a lot of restoring there, minimal change of personnel for various reasons. And then we headed south with the first part of the task group, waiting for the UK ships to catch us up. So really, I suppose that the mood did not change. We were still high morale. We all believed that a diplomatic solution would prevail, right up until, I suppose, we got down towards the tears, the total exclusion zone, and then Belgrano was sunk. I think that was the first time we realised that that's a massive loss of life, and things started to move. Okay, perhaps we are going into a real war here. And then probably the most second significant event was sadly when we lost HMS Sheffield, dear old shiny chef, in an incident that day. Took an Exocet missile, which caused them to abandon ship. Heavy loss of life. I think about 21 shipmates of Sheffield lost their lives. And that really was a smell of the coffee moment for many of us. I remember standing on the bridge looking on the horizon and seeing Sheffield smoking away there. And that was a very sad day. Of course, we're all wondering, we all knew somebody and it's a Type 42, the same as Coventry, and we all knew somebody inside Sheffield. And of course, you're wondering how many had lost their lives. And that was a very sad day indeed. And we realised that we weren't going to go home with a diplomatic solution. We would have to fight this war.
How does that affect the ship's crew? What were those moments like? I mean, I imagine they're kind of sort of seared into your memory a little bit in terms of the impact it had. I mean, I'm obviously assuming there. What was the impact on people?
The impact of seeing Sheffield, or knowing that Sheffield had been hit and we'd lost a Type 42 destroyer, and then days later, of course, she sunk. Morale certainly still stayed very high, and we all just practiced and did our jobs, and that's all we could do. I don't think I heard anybody actually complaining or moaning about anything. Mood stayed good, and we all stayed very professional. We're a very close-knit team in a ship, certainly within the operations room. Everybody knew their jobs, everybody did their jobs, and we all relied on each other to come through. So once we got into heavy air attacks, which became quite regular, you were in air raid warning red and action stations quite often. And living in a ship where you're constantly at action stations, where everything is secured, tied down, it's a different way of life than living in a ship in a normal cruising watch in peacetime. So things become different, very disciplined, and you have to work as a team to get through situations like that. And that's what we did. And in Coventry, we did it very well indeed.
So this is all about professionalism and where the training kicks in, isn't it?
Professionalism and the training that's instilled in you. And the first lieutenant had on the times Transit South, during the time of the Transit South, the first lieutenant had us practicing and more practice with internal MBCD type exercises, which involved first aid situations. So we were well worked up. We knew, as I say, everybody knew their jobs, and everybody, to a man, I think, busied themselves with whatever they could. If they weren't on watch, they were perhaps getting some recreational time in the mess, watching a movie, something like that. But morale, as I remember, still stayed very, very high indeed. And that was one thing I always do think, that within Coventry, it was a good thing. It was a good, very close-knit team.
What activities, if that's the right phrase, operations was Coventry involved in during the conflict?
Probably the first activity I remember, that apart from general surveillance, because we were an air defence ship, so we had an anti-ship missile defence type role. There wasn't a big air to surface missile threat, but it would have been conventional bombs. So, but the first role we had was probably in naval gun support into Stanley and the airfield, using our 4.5 gun. After that, we were put together with HMS Broadsword Type 22 and what we call the 42-22 combo, where Broadsword could offer some sheltering, if you like, in the ASMD umbrella of close-in surface-to-air missile system that she had to support our Sea Dart system. So those are the two things that we were really naval gun support initially. Although we did lose the 4.5 gun at one stage, become US and had to be fixed. And then when the order finally came from moving towards the amphibious landings in San Carlos water, the order came from the Admiral Sandy Woodward that Coventry and Broadsword would take up position north of Pebble Island, and we were put there very close to land, about 8 miles actually, as a missile trap to stop enemy aircraft getting a clear run down what become famously known as Bomb Alley to attack the amphibious landing and the ships that were there to support the amphibious landings.
I think it's important for our listeners to understand, isn't it, the kind of weapon systems that both ships had and how that was kind of affected by your location. I think it's quite important for people to understand that, isn't it? Could you elaborate on that a little bit for me, please?
Yeah, the weapon system that Coventry had, the 4.5 gun, of course, but the air defence system was the Sea Dart, controlled by a 909 radar. And to effectively use the Sea Dart missile system, we would need a reasonable range, probably in excess of 25 miles to get an effective firing solution. Could be done in less than that. But the position we were stationed of 8 miles from land, knowing that the Argentine Air Force or pilots would attack us or come at the task group, and we were the furthest west, over West Falkland, low, hugging the contours of the land, so their aircraft would be lost to radar in what we call the ground clutter. And we didn't have on our search radars, on our 992 search radars, we didn't have what we call a Doppler capability, which can see frequency shift, Doppler frequency shift, so the aircraft moving fast against a slower object would be exposed. We didn't have that, and the Argentine pilots knew that if they hugged the contours, they were lost in the ground clutter and basically blind to our active radar systems, and that was a worry. The captain did ask several times in discussion with the Admiral that we were too close and we couldn't really perform with our Sea Dart that close to land, and could we move further out to sea? And the answer came back several times, no, stay where you are. So we were really a forfeit. We were in a suicide position, if you like, and that's the way it turned out, sadly, in the end, of course.
So how do you feel about that? Because we've talked about this before, haven't we, before we actually recorded this session. And I think there's a point to understand here that it was a very important role to be played, but as you've just alluded to, quite a risky place to be, as it turned out.
We always knew it would be risky because of the situation being so close to land. We did get good indicators and warnings from our other sources that were dug in over on Argentinian mainland that aircraft were taking off from the airfields. And so with a quite simple time and distance calculation, you could tell, and we had a 965 long range early warning radar as well. You could get air contacts at pretty good ranges, a couple of 100 miles, but they would then go low. So we knew within probably 10, 15 minutes roughly when we could expect unwanted incoming, if you like, to attack us. So we were pretty well geared up for that, and we'd already taken out several enemy aircraft, Skyhawks and Mirages, in leading up to our fateful day, using that same method. And also we had combat air patrol with the Harriers, often providing top cover as well. And we did the best we could, but morale still stayed very high, and we all just did our jobs, and we did our jobs very well indeed. Coventry represented themselves very well up until the time to the 25th of May.
Let's talk about the 25th of May. It's obviously a very important date. What exactly happened? It's also an important date for the Argentine country, Argentina as a country, isn't it?
Yeah, the 25th of May is the Argentine National Day, and we understood that the Argentinians were looking for high-value targets, high-value units that day. And Coventry, being there with broadsword, were obviously an annoyance to them, an irritation to those pilots. So we'd assumed and accepted that we were probably going to be one of their targets for that day. So the sunrise on the 25th of May, I remember it. I was on the upper deck with my morning brew quite early, always up, mostly in the morning times. You could get up to the upper deck outside of being at action stations. And I remember looking over, seeing Pebble Island. It was a bright blue sunny day. There was calm seas, little swell in the South Atlantic. And to be honest, that was the worst possible weather for the task group for their 25th of May, their National Day, because it provided perfect conditions for the enemy to use visual targeting to toss the bombs from the aircraft. And that's what they were going to do. Use those perfect conditions to actually select us as a target. They didn't need any electronics to deliver those weapons with a nice clear day like that.
So the Argentinians are after a bit of a propaganda coup because it was their national day. Would you like to talk me through the rest of the events of that day, please?
Yeah, the final day, 25th of May, progressed with an air raid in the morning. We shot one aircraft down there, and a second raid in the afternoon. And a final raid was anticipated early evening. But as time went on, I remember discussing in the operations room, saying, "What is it? They've never attacked us in the hours of when it's been dark, so after sunset." And time was getting on. It wasn't quite sunset, but we did get indicators middle of the afternoon that aircraft had taken off. In fact, we were told that two Skyhawks had left an airfield in Argentina and were on their way, and we just assumed that probably we would be on their target list. And time and distance said they'd be with us around 1800 or just after, and that's just about what it was. It was around the 1800 mark where we were all looking, all eyes in the ops room, upper deck lookouts, off to the watch, visual, all our radar sensors, electronic warfare, all looking down that threat bearing out to the west, anticipating that final air attack of the day. Hoping it wouldn't come, but unfortunately it did come. So I remember that seeing on radar, looking over the shoulder of one of my electronic warfare director, seeing the two aircraft break land over Pebble Island and come that way. And then really, as I'm turning to tell the captain that we're about to be attacked, and I think others, the noise, the volume in the operations room started increasing. You could hear on open mic from the upper deck that people weren't getting excited, but doing their jobs and going through the processes to try and obtain these aircraft as valid targets. First of all, for the 909 radar to acquire and then launch CDAR, that did not happen. They could not get a firing solution, could not get a lock on. And then I remember hearing the 20mm Orlakin gun on the upper deck firing away as well at these two low approaching aircraft. Shouts, various visual going off, and then things slowed down. There was a thud that wasn't a loud explosion. It was just like a dull thud, and then followed by extreme heat and a flash and a fireball whipping around the operations room, where obviously we'd been hit. And I remember that extreme heat, and I must have been thrown to the deck. And the next thing I knew, and I don't know how many minutes, but it must have only been minutes, I'm coming around and realizing my situation, and I was under desk of one of the electronic warfare equipment, I think, with lots of wires around my legs. And I remember thinking, I'm not going to lose my life or end my life here. I remember I could just see a picture of my wife and my 2 boys in my mind, thinking, no, I'm going to get out. That was my motivation. My arm was on fire. My right arm was on fire completely with loose clothing. I had to put that out. I remember looking over to the port side where the bomb had gone into below us, into the computer room and lower down, and the water was coming in. There was fires all around the operations room. It was thick black smoke as well. And I found the strength from somewhere, as say, this motivation of not wanting to lose my life there. And I pulled the wires away and managed to get up. And I realized I was in quite a state. I had very little clothing left on, just my underpants and boots was about it, and a little bit of my number 8 dress, collar and sleeve, a bit of loose sleeve hanging down my left arm. And that was it. I was completely naked apart from that, quite exposed, very badly burned, and I realised I was in a lot of pain. I think the adrenaline sort of carried me through the next few moments where I made it out onto the starboard passageway outside the operations room. The ladders were all blown away. There was no escape from the ops room up to the wardroom flat. That was the ladder was gone. The door was blown off the starboard side. I managed to get out of the passageway where I came across a messmate of mine, actually, shipmate Sam McFarlane. He'd just been doing some emergency destruction in the MCO, the main communications office, and he grabbed me. He could see I was in some distress. I'm not sure at that time if he knew who I was, because I was covered in all sorts of unmentionables and black smoke and very badly burnt and scabbing up. But he helped me out. He pushed me up some handholds onto another deck, and then a couple of decks up. I remember coming across another messmate of mine, a PO steward, Paddy. He was there trying to help me. He was a first aider. And Paddy was concerned about getting water onto my burns. On my back was completely stripped, and he could see that I needed water. I remember he asked me to lay down. So I lay down in the ordered Sam to go off and find some water. And Sam went off with his action mug, a plastic action mug, to try and scoop water out the toilets to throw over my back. Whether I could say fortunately or unfortunately, he didn't find any anyway. All the water was gone from the sinks and the toilets, and the ship was in a bad state. And no water was to be found, so we decided to make our way out onto the upper deck, clear the signal deck. So that's what we did. Still almost naked, actually, getting up there. And then I remember coming out onto the upper deck and making our way over to the starboard side and coming across the captain and a few others that were there. Most of the ship's company by then had left the ship. The order to abandon ship, of course, was never given. You didn't need to be told to abandon the ship. It was going over, and it was going over quite quickly. At that stage, we already have a really good list to port. So the only way off was to slide down the starboard side. On approaching the captain, apparently he got someone to put you can see that I had very little clothing on, no life jacket. I was blown away. He asked somebody to put a white Seaman's jersey, those thick wool Seaman's jersey over me, and then a life jacket, which I put on. And it was basically leave the ship. And it was looking down. I remember looking out and seeing this, which I always describe as a flotilla of orange life rafts that were bobbing around off the ship at various distances, and then broadsword in the distance as well. And at that time, there was no other aircraft around. I remember, I do have a memory that something was hitting the deck and we thought it might be a Skyhawk that had come back to do some strafing, but I don't know if that is how accurate that is, whether I've been told that or not. Because as the years go by, you have some of your own memories and then some things that shipmates tell you, and they become a bit of a blur. What's your memory and what's somebody else's memory? And I've heard others that say this. So that's to the point where now I'm looking down and to slide down the ship's side. And this is where your training kicks in. Before you join a ship, you have to do survival training, sea survival training, and one of those is how to enter the water with a life jacket and the correct way. And by the way, don't, whether you jump in or slide down a ship's side, miss the stabilizers, which could give you a nasty bang on the head. So I did. I pinched my nose, hand over the life jacket to stop it from flashing up, and away I went. Slid down the ship's side and into the cold, salty South Atlantic water, which was immediate first aid for me, actually. It was immediate first aid, in fact, that it seemed to take all my pain away. I still had a lot of adrenaline running in me, clearly. And some of this is not so vivid, but I do remember hitting the cold water thinking, oh, that's not so bad. And I was a good swimmer, so it was pick a life raft and swam out to a life raft. I remember approaching the life raft, and there was, in fact, one of my leading hands, actually, he had a drogue or something stuck around his leg and was struggling to get in the life raft. So I swam down and unhooked him, untied him and pushed him in, and then put my arms up to be pulled in. But immediately I was pulled into the life raft by my shipmates. That was extreme pain then, with the cold air hit my burns, especially off my back, my face, my arms, my legs. I was badly burnt. It turned out to be 27% actually, which I learned later on Uganda. So that was me in the life raft. And then it was a case of, they made room for me in the life raft. This black thing with a white seaman's jersey was laying in the middle. They made room for me, and then it was to wait to be rescued. But the adventure carried on, if you like. And I don't have too many memories of what happened in the life raft. But what they tell me is I fought them wildly to not give me a morphine injection. They could see I was in a lot of pain, and I refused this morphine jab. And in the end, one of the officers in there decided, Dick Lane it was, I think, he decided, no, leave him alone. It's obviously causing him stress, let him lay there. And then it was, I suppose, a case of being rescued. Broadsword had sent a Gemini over, a rigid inflatable boat over to pull us away, because the ship, we were going back underneath the ship and the ship was coming over. The wind had blown us under. I remember they threw a line round. I do remember that, seeing the lads passing this line around everybody inside the life raft that was going to be pulled away by the Gemini. But somehow that line managed to snap and it whiplashed into the Gemini, punctured it, and then the two broadsword guys ended up in our life raft, I believe. But eventually, we were forced, I think helicopters came and used rotors to blow some of the life rafts away from the ship. And eventually I remember being winched up. I was the first one out. Somebody must have triaged me and winched me out onto the broadsword and our rescue ship, because they were our escort ship in the 42-22 combo. So then I'm on to broadsword, and their question to them was to have a look, triage, I suppose, and see what they're going to do with me. And very quickly, having been received by the medical team on there, they decided that I was too badly injured and that I had to be taken to the field hospital that Commander Rick Jolly was running. And that's what happened. I was put into a Neil Robertson stretcher, tied in very securely, carried up to the forecastle of broadsword, and it was on the forecastle. I remember thinking, why am I doing this, being winched up underneath the Sea King off the forecastle? Later to learn that one of the Skyhawks had managed to put in an unexploded bomb that bounced or went through the flight deck of broadsword and decommissioned it. Therefore, any transfers or any helo ops had to take place from the forecastle. So I'm being winched up underneath this Sea King, and I remember as the winch was coming down to be attached to the strop on my Neil Robertson stretcher, and I don't know why I said this, I just shouted out, "Don't forget the earthing pole! Don't forget the earthing pole!" And because if you don't use an earthing pole when the strop's being winched down from a helicopter, then whoever grabs that strop is going to take all that static electricity through their body to hit the metal deck of the ship. So that's a standard procedure. I don't know why I thought about that. So I'm winched up, I'm being winched up, and there's a bit of a gust of wind, and the stretcher's hit, and it swings round, and my head starts going into this, what I think was the exhaust of the Sea King. But the air crewman on board was quick thinking, and he jumped sort of semi out and pushed it away, the strop away, and then finally managed to pull me in to the Sea King. So I was in there then, and they shoved a headset on me straight away, so I could hear the internal comms between the pilot, the observer, and the air crew, the air crewman. And so then I was listening to what was going on, and at this stage I still hadn't had any pain relief. So I remember laying there in this stretcher, bundled up, thinking, "Oh, what are they going to do with me now?"
You're now on the helicopter. You're probably just hovering above the carnage that is now a HMS Coventry. What happened next, and how did you get back to Blighty as well?
So I'm in the helicopter to Neil Robertson, and I've got a headset on so I can hear everything. Their plan was to take me to the field hospital that was being manned by Rick Jolly and his crew, which I think was at Ajax Bay. We landed there actually, and somebody ran out. One of the medical guys ran out and said, "No, we can't take any more. They're dealing with an unexploded bomb, so they're evacuating this." And I could hear this, thinking, "Oh well, this can't get any worse." But clearly, it could. So the pilot took off, and there was very low on fuel, on fumes, I think, and he needed an immediate refueling, and he had to get me we was told we've got to get him to Uganda, the hospital ship. Of course, under the Geneva Convention, the hospital ship is not on comms with the military. You have to go a roundabout way through the UK, and there's all sorts of Geneva Convention rules about how a hospital ship works. But he knew where it was, and he started to make his way out there, but asking on the whatever circuit it was to ask any ship to take them to do a refuel. And I think Fort Austin came up, and we landed on Fort Austin. We did a refuel, got the fuel, and then off out to Uganda. And I remember we landed on Uganda, and it was the helicopter landing pad was the covered up swimming pool from the cruise ship, and being wheeled down. And this is definitely my memory. I'm laying in the stretcher on the trolley, and I'm being wheeled down the ramp into this receiving area. Massive open area, and then all of a sudden I'm surrounded by all these medical people, and they're all firing questions at me. And one of the ones was, have you had pain relief? And one of them said, "Well, he must have had morphine. Look at, he's in a bad way." And although I had a seaman's jersey on, they couldn't really see the extent, and my back was completely stripped of skin. So there was this discussion going on. They were asking me the questions, which I didn't answer. I could hear the questions, but I wasn't answering. He must have had morphine. And so someone said, "No, he hasn't had morphine. There's no red M, Mike, on my forehead," which is what you do to somebody in the field if you give them morphine, or you should do. Somebody was clever enough to say, "No, he definitely hasn't had morphine. We're going to have to give him some." So they started plugging things into my arms, IVs and things like that, and this discussion going on around me. So I remember that bit. Then probably the next thing I'm thinking is waking up, if you like, or compos mentis, more than I was on the 25th of May in the burns ward on Uganda. I couldn't see.
Gosh.
I could not see, and that panicked me big time. Very quickly, and I don't know who it was, but one of the nurses or medical staff had come to talk to me and say, "Look, this is where you are, and your eyes have swollen up, but your eyesight will come back." And of course, I had to believe that. And true enough, it did. I don't know how long, a day or two, a couple of days later, my eyesight did come back. And once I saw those little slits of light, then that was great. That was fantastic, because I honestly thought they were just telling me, "Oh, you'll be okay," and I was going to be blind. And then you get all sorts of dark thoughts. How do I face life when I'm blind? And that's awful to think, because many people do. But at that time, that was my thoughts. Luckily for me, that wasn't the case, and it was very lucky. I started to see again. and start to come round and come to terms with my injuries. And it was explained to me. I mean, I could see then that I had things coming out of both arms and I had a lot of pain. So I was on a lot of pain relief tablets and IVs, and laying in what I can only describe as a lot of fluid. It was pouring out on my back, my arms, and my legs. Burns, suffering from burns. One of the biggest killers, of course, is shock, and then it's infection, and then loss of fluids. I think I must have had all three of those in big numbers.
Yeah.
I got a massive infection in my right arm, which I had to sort out. And I was telling them, "Oh yeah, my arm's always this big." And of course, there's a big load of skin underneath my elbow that was full of nasty fluids that they had to drain and get rid of. So I did get an infection there, which they cured. They did well. But life, went on in Uganda, and I remember thinking then, I really would love to have a bath. There was a discussion that took place and said, "Yeah, we need you to have a bath because I was still, and I was no mirror. They didn't give me a mirror. There's no mirror around. They probably didn't want me to see what I looked like." Because one of the when you call him a steward, but one of the merchant guys on Uganda who volunteered to go down there. They're all volunteers, the guys that run there, and he was working in the medical ward. He actually came up to me and said to me, "When you come in here the other night, you look like something out the Hammer House of Horror." I thought, charming. So anyway, a discussion was had, and then they explained to me, we're going to get you into a bath, and that's what they did. So I was prepared for the bath and was warned that once I got in that water, it was a hottish, warm saline solution bath, which was going to be not only going to be cleaned up, but also treat some burns and reduce infections and things like that. So that's what they did. So I went into this bath, and it really did hurt. It felt like somebody, as soon as I got into that water, it felt like somebody had a blowtorch running down my back. It was really severe. But the good thing is, it only lasted really a minute or so, if that. And suddenly the pain went away. So I enjoyed a bath. They washed my hair several times and got all that crap out. So my hair was then cleaned, and I was feeling a little bit better, the fact that you'd had a bath. And then it was, right, now we need to tell you some other bad news, really. When you get out of the bath, it's going to hurt just as much because you're exposed to the fresh air. So we had well-rehearsed, for the first time we did it, of course, it was a bit slower, but well-rehearsed, what I call a bath exit strategy, where a bunch of nurses would prepare a massive pad the size of my back that wrapped around the sides as well, covered in this wonderful stuff called flamazine, which was a cream that not only takes away pain but fights infections on burns. And it was something that was created and during the Vietnam War against napalm burns and things like this, and it was very good. It's nectar for the gods, I think, this stuff. So it was out of the bath, and the pain hit me. It really did. So that was true. Then it was lean over a table, and they just threw this big pad covered in this cream on me, and then strapped that on and bandaged that on to my back. And that was a routine that was well practiced for the next few weeks coming out of the bath.
So you say the next few weeks. Is that how long the journey took to get home?
So I was on Uganda the best part of 4 weeks.
Oh wow!
I guess, yeah. And then finally, there's my shipmates that were, and I mean, my thoughts in those days, laying there as well, contemplating what happened, how many had survived. All these thoughts were going on, and then thinking about my wife, my boys, and my family. Do they know what's happened to me? There's so much goes on in your mind when you're laying there in that, 8,000 miles south from the UK, and wondering, well, what does life mean to me now? How do I recover from this? And I mean, you could easily feel sorry for yourself. I had shipmates around me in the early days, one or two that had walking wounded with minor burns that were eventually every day that came by. Some were leaving, being repatriated. Quite a few of them went over to the QE2, and most of my shipmates came back on the QE2, well ahead of me. But Eli, was also he was badly burnt he had 22% burnt, and Phil Fisher had 19%, and we were the last three on there. Although Eli was walking wounded, he used to try and raise my morale, which he succeeded in doing. About midnight, he'd come along and I'd hear a little, and that was a tin of beer opening next to my ear with a straw put into my mouth, and he'd feed me a tin of beer now and again, and that was quite good against all the medical advice, of course, because you're on heavy medical drugs, if you like. But we did that, and that was quite good. And it was many, many years later that I found out from one of the nurses at a reunion of the Uganda team that they knew about that, but they decided it was good for morale, and they let it continue. A crafty tin of beer. So probably 4 weeks around that on Uganda. Managed to dictate some telegrams back home to my wife Margaret, which was good. That was a big relief to get things away. The day finally came where we were told that us, the last three, would be heading north, start our journey north, and that was to be a transfer by Hilo over to HMS Hecla, which was one of our survey ships, one of 3 survey ships that had been taken up, the white ships, and they were called the ambulance ships, to provide the ambulance escort, if you like, from the TEZ, from the TEZ up to Montevideo. And the Montevideo, we had VC-10s coming down from Bryce Norton via Ascension to pick up casualties and repatriators. And that's what happened to us. We went to the Hecla, 3 of us, Eli, Phil and myself. And
so when were you reunited with your family? How long, and when was that in relation to the 25th of May?
25th of May we were sunk, and finally reunited with my family at RAF Rawton. My wife was there very end of June, early July. I remember I was home for my son's first birthday on the 3rd of July, so it was around that time. So you're talking about 5 weeks from being sunk to finally getting home, and that's to RAF Rawton, RAF Hospital, and then from there transported down to single service hospitals, and ours was Royal Naval Hospital in Haslar, Gosport. And I was in there for 4 or 5 days, convalescing and being reviewed. They finally discharged me to home care, where Margaret had to start nursing me back to health, and that was the next phase of the road to recovery, if you like. And that was with the creams and the bandages and the pads to get those burns better, to avoid infection.
When were you able to return to service?
So convalescing for a good few weeks after that, and then I actually went to HMS Victory to take over Chief Boatswain's Mate and VIP Guide on HMS Victory as a temporary position whilst awaiting a permanent new draft out to ComNav South out in Naples in Italy as the electronic warfare advisor. I'd already had that draft prior to us going south to the Falklands, and I honestly thought, well, I'm not going to get that now. That was 2 years out in Naples. But they come along, and my divisional officer came along to see me and asked me, did I still want to keep that draft, that posting? And of course I said, yeah, it'd be great opportunity, because they're few and far between, to take my family overseas and live overseas in a NATO job for a couple of years, which we did. So from about, I think it was around August on HMS Victory, learning all about that as a VIP guide for a few months. And then finally in the November, I drove my family out to, took 3 days and drove out to Italy and took up a position there. But once the summer came in Naples, it was quite hard. It was a bit hot for me. My burns were still very raw on the skin, and certainly on my forehead and my back. I had to keep shirts on. I couldn't go and lay on a beach all day long or by a pool. I had to be very careful. And even today, 40 years on, I catch the sun in 15, 20 minutes and I'm burning. So it's slap on factor 50 sunscreen wherever I go out into the sun or anything like that. So that's nothing compared to others that sadly lost their lives, and somehow I was lucky enough to survive it. So, and there's not a day goes by I don't think about what happened 40 years ago on the 25th of May. And there's all sorts of triggers that come across in your daily life that bring you, that take you rushing back there to that moment in that operations room where that happened, and then thinking about 19 shipmates that didn't make it, and why didn't they make it? Why did I make it? When the bomb literally was only a deck away, and so you're talking numbers of feet, yards away from you, and you survived, and yet the compartment immediately below us, they lost their lives, and others did in the ship as well, and that's a sad thing, very sad thing.
It's extremely sad, and I can't begin to understand really what that's like for you, Chris. But I'm very appreciative of you sharing your experiences. I think it's important that we remember these experiences and recognise those that are no longer with us. But you obviously are still involved, as a veteran with other veterans. You're a trustee of SAMA 82 and chairman of the HMS Coventry D118 Association. Could you tell me a little bit about those, please?
Yeah, I still work within the military, if you like, anyway, by providing electronic warfare training courses. And so I like to keep in touch with things military, and two ways in which I can do that. And I know I can provide some sort of support to other veterans, perhaps, that are suffering, is being chair of HMS Coventry Association, which is an absolute honour to be able to run that. And essentially within the D18 Association, I'm just ensuring that there is for those that want to, each year we have a service of remembrance, followed by an hour or so after that, a reunion where we all get together with our families. And now we're into bringing grandchildren along. So we've got, 2 decades, 2 generations since the Falklands now. And I do that to make sure that we always remember and we never forget what happened. And so by being chairman, then I can make sure that happens. And when I give up the chairman position, hopefully someone that takes over from me will have those same aims as well and objectives to make sure that there's a tight ship's company family group that we can still, for those that want to, we can still get together. And there are those that will support it every year, and those that from a distance will know that's going on, and in their own way they will remember what happened 40 years ago. So once I saw the position of trustee, or a couple of trustees positions were up in 2020 for volunteers to come forward from those that held the South Atlantic Medal, I thought I'd volunteer and put my name forward to do a similar job, if you like, as a trustee on SAMA 82. Again, I felt that I had something to offer. I had experiences of listening and understanding some of what those that had PTSD and those that have been through things, they've seen things that are up here in their minds. It might not be physical, but some of the mental scars are the things that really plague us from one day to the next. And they're the ones that we, as men, we're not good at always sharing those things. And I've learned that you do have to share, and sharing makes it easy. And it might not necessarily be with some medically qualified university guy that's got a degree in psychology and stuff like that. Often I feel that it's lending an ear over a beer or a glass of decent red, and you can share and say, yeah, you just listen. And you can come in, yeah, I understand that because I've been through that myself. I know exactly what you mean because I do that as well. And sometimes I think that we forget it's this mental thing that you carry with you for probably forever.
Yeah.
And that's what needs dealing with. And so as a trustee on SAMA, I feel I've got something to offer. And that's why I do this job. It's been very busy this year with the public relations of the 40th anniversary, of course. And it has been very busy, but there's been a lot of media interest in promoting programs, which will only go on to raise awareness of what happened 40 years ago, and those 255 servicemen that lost their lives, and the 3 Falkland Islanders, and the fact that Argentina, even 40 years on, continue to say that they have some claim over the Falkland Islands, where that's simply not true. So associations like SAMA 82, we continue into a good few years yet, and in fact it's the 25th anniversary of the actual association this year as well. So that's something that we would promote. Certainly, I'm hoping to promote within this series of podcasts.
Well, as I've said to you before, shameless plugging of any services or activities that help support those who've served is absolutely a good thing. And I do think you have an awful lot to offer to SAMA 82. And, thank you for that on behalf of those that benefit from it. But if people listening to your story today are kind of affected by any of those issues or know somebody, they can get in touch with SAMA, and you can provide me with the contact details. I can put all that in the description below for a website or anything, but is that something you would actively encourage, I assume?
I would certainly encourage that. The promulgation of these podcasts, and indeed the official Falklands 40 book that I've also written my story for input. And I've also written a poem for that book as well, which will be really a poem for my shipmates at our reunion, which will be read out long before the book is published. But yeah, we would support that anyone that feels that they want to be involved in SAMA or come to these type of events, that they contact any of us trustees, any of the on the board. And whilst we not medically qualified to assist them, we can signpost them to different associations, not just for support to really detail or deal with PTSD, but there might be some financial hardships as well that they can be helped with. There is help out there, and there are dozens and dozens of associations out there that are willing to help veterans that are struggling or fallen on hard times, or just want company, or just want to come and talk to like-minded veterans that have been through something similar to themselves. There's breakfast clubs all up and down the country now. I know of a few. I've got one in my local town. There's events going on most weeks of the year. There's something going on somewhere in the country, whether it's Scotland, England, over in the US, Australia. There's pieces of SAMA and memberships of SAMA that are holding events and that for like-minded veterans to go and join. And you're pushing on open doors if you ever do approach any of us that work in the SAMA community, and certainly any of the trustees, and you're most welcome.
So there's a very, very clear message there. If you want some help or just someone to chat to with some similar experiences, please get in touch. All the info is in the description below, which Chris will provide to us. And I would just like to finish up by saying, Chris, thank you so much for sharing that. It's a remarkable story. I know there are others that have had experiences as a result of the Falklands, but anybody who needs help, please get in touch. Thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And thank you for facilitating the opportunity of this podcast. I think it will go a long way.
It's a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much.
Now, before Stephen might look back at the interview we've just heard, you may be interested to know that here at Company of Makers, we've got loads of online activities for veterans to get involved in. As well as this podcast, we've got online talks with inspiring guests, and we've got workshops where you can learn something new and meet like-minded people from the forces. To find out more, sign up for our newsletter and we'll send all the latest updates direct to your inbox. Just head over to companyofmakers.com/newsletter. Now back to Steve and Mike.
Another remarkable story there, HMS Coventry.
Absolutely remarkable, and also quite emotional. I will admit to welling up a bit at stage to that what actually was quite a harrowing tale, and beautifully told by Chris. What a fantastic interview.
Yes, it was very interesting because I dare say he's told that story in many different capacities before. But I think he did get emotional whilst retelling that story. And I think you need any demonstration of how people are still living with the events of 40 years ago. There's proof enough there.
Do you know what? I'm not sure he has told the whole story like that before. I think he's told elements of it. But I think actually the whole story was written down for the first time for the book that accompanies this podcast. And I think there are elements of it that he didn't know about at the time that he's become aware of during the various reunions that filled in the gaps. I think that's actually a theme of several of the people that you have discussions with.
It's definitely a theme, and it's quite an interesting one because you have all the different people that we've spoken to about the Falklands. They're in sort of different places, but the stories all weave together, and how effectively they've all supported one another by filling in those gaps, as you say.
There was so much in that interview that you could comment on and look at. I don't really know where to start, although Gibraltar's quite a good place because, part of the luck in getting a task force assembled and sent south as quickly is that we had an exercise going on in the Mediterranean just completed, and the ships were preparing to go back to the UK after a spot of R&R when the Argentinians invaded. So we had a really fully worked up mini task force, that were told to turn left, not right. And I think Steve and Chris's comment about, that they were slightly annoyed at that point that a bunch of Argentinians support their run ashore and plans for East to leave, and the rabbits they bought in Gibraltar weren't going to get to their loved ones. Rabbits, by the way, if you haven't heard that term, are things that you buy, little souvenirs that you buy to take home to your loved ones. But the mood was, they were slightly miffed that the Argentinians had ruined their run ashore.
Come on, be honest, Mike. You don't want to get in front of a Matlow's run ashore, do you? You don't want to be the person stopping that.
Well, I think as events unfolded, the Argentinians found that out to their cost. But actually, it was interesting because when they sailed south, the mood on board, as Chris portrayed it, was one of, apart from the fact they weren't going back to the UK on leave, morale was high, but they didn't anticipate it would get to the fighting stage. They thought that it would be solved by diplomatic means, and at that point in this story, this is the war they didn't think would happen.
Yeah, that's true, and I think it's also a theme in many of the other podcasts that we're going to be doing in the other episodes around the Falklands. A lot of people felt that. Indeed, many people didn't even know where it was, let alone whether it would come to anything.
Yeah, that's very true, actually. I expect it's still true of some people now, but we'll move on from that. The other thing that was really interesting at that point, this sort of journey south, was he was the petty officer electronic warfare officer on board, and he was also the intelligence officer. And all of the intelligence was geared towards the Soviets at that time. And that was 40 years ago. What's changed now? But actually, their information about the Argentinians was really just what they got from open source book like Jane's Fighting Ships. That's all they had. It was paltry.
Also, the Argentinians had Type 42s as well. So I guess we would have known, obviously, your own ship. So you would have therefore known the enemy's ships as well. So I think you're right about Jane's, absolutely. But I think we probably knew also a lot about their fighting ability in terms of equipment. Yeah,
well, some of the equipment. Not all of it, So actually that was, so they went down to Ascension, where more of the task force collected, and they got on stores that they had been collecting in Gibraltar, and they continued south, still believing that the war would never happen. It would be solved by diplomatic means. And I do remember the Hague diplomacy shuttles going on at the time.
I have a very vivid recollection of that shuttle diplomacy, and Al Hague going backwards and forwards. Doing some research for these casts, I recognised Al Hague, having probably not seen his face for 40 years. I only saw it then. I was on TV when I was 16. But yes, it really stayed in my mind.
All that started to change when they recaptured South Georgia at the end of April. And there was that famous, I can never forget it, that famous press headline that says, "Be pleased to inform Her Majesty that South Georgia has now been placed back again, Her Majesty's as possession," or whatever it was, but be pleased to announce. So that was the first time that actually force was used, although it was a relatively minor event compared to what was about to come. it was probably the sinking of the Belgrano by HMS Conqueror on the 3rd of May where the mood shifted to actually this is really happening. Lives are lost. This is going to hurt, sort of thing. So that was probably when the mood changed on board, and then of course it changed further again a day or two later when HMS Sheffield, the Shiny Chef, was struck by Exocet missiles and had to be abandoned.
I don't think if you need two events to make it real, I mean, there was no doubt then, was there? None whatsoever.
Yes, and there's been a lot talking about those, and I don't think we need to occupy the airways with those. Although the only thing about the Sheffield was that she was a Type 42 destroyer, just like HMS Coventry. So the people on board HMS Coventry, Chris's ship, would have realised they weren't invincible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then he talks about Coventry and Broadsword taking up station, basically as an air picket to provide air defence and against Argentina air attacks. Because what most people know is that after the Belgrano was sunk, the Argentine Navy effectively retired to its home ports and never really threatened the British task force again. So one of the outcomes of the Belgrano was that it went from a 3-dimensional air, land and sea to effectively 2-dimensional air attacks and ground troops on the ground, with us holding supremacy of the sea.
And facing a very determined Argentine Air Force, of course.
Very determined Argentine Air Force, and we know of other ships that were suffered. But he of course concentrates on what happened in Coventry, and on that fateful day, the 25th of May, which of course was a day of national celebration in Argentina. So if they wanted to do something, the 25th of May was a good day to do it from a national pride perspective. And they thought they got through it, and I think they were talking about it was getting on for late in the day, and they thought they survived it. There'd been a couple of raids in the morning and the afternoon, and then of course the final raid, late afternoon, early evening, which was unsuccessfully defended.
Well, they were in a very exposed position, weren't they? And there was a lot of complexity in terms of what ships are designed for, which obviously he talks about in detail. I think, that's probably, they thought, as he said, they'd got over the line for that particular day.
Your discussion almost slows down as he then describes what happened. The thud, not an explosion, a thud, and then a flash and a fireball, and then severe heat. And then he doesn't know much more, I think. I think he's pieced together a lot of what he talked to you about from subsequent conversations. But he does remember, obviously, somehow saying, well, I'm not going to die today. I'm going to get out of this ship. Realising the ship was going to sink, and that he would have to get to the upper deck to escape. Thinking about whether he jumped or slid down the side. Which life raft did he go for? All of this is kind of in slow motion, and he's in pain. He's in lots of pain.
I was going to say that, and all that is going along whilst he has been severely burnt. I mean, remarkable. The will to survive is a remarkable thing, isn't it? We've talked about adrenaline in other interviews, but adrenaline does funny things to people. When he was in the life raft, he refused morphine. He was in severe pain, and he refused morphine. And they noted later when he was on the hospital ship that he didn't have the red M on his forehead. He hadn't taken morphine. And that can only be adrenaline kicking in, and just that fight for survival. It's remarkable, really. Anyway, so the story then continues where, he's transferred to a helicopter, and somehow talks about shouting out, don't forget the earthing pole. This is stop the static electricity that you might get from a helicopter transfer. I mean, unbelievable what people think of when they're in distress.
and then obviously to the Canberra, the Great White Whale, and obviously a lengthy journey home and a lengthy recovery.
Just coming back to don't forget the earthing pole, it speaks volumes about the value of training, doesn't it? It's like, right, you said there were a well-worked-up crew who were meant to turn right, but they turned left, as you put it, and just the importance of training.
He describes it as a funny incident. I mean, it's funny now. It probably wasn't funny at the time, where they decided that he needed a bath. Had he been a submariner, I'm sure that wouldn't have happened. But anyway, and he described it as a scene out of the Hammer House of Horror. It's a lovely turn of phrase. And the bath, and actually, despite his, anxiety about getting in it, I think actually it was a soothing balm to the pain that was caused. And I don't think you and I could ever understand, what that pain must have felt like.
Not at all. I mean, just the way he describes it. I mean, it's just, and he's also sent me the photos actually of when, I don't know if he was on Uganda or Canberra from the photos, but it's pretty severe by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, it's Canberra. Obviously, he arrived home in July. This is after the Argentine surrendered on the 14th of June. So the fighting was over. We'd taken back the islands. And he was transferred down to the Navy's hospital in Haslar, which is Gosport, for a few days before and reunited with his family. And he's still, this is still living with him now. He's still living this story, and has been doing so for the last 40 years.
And like I said, he continues to serve, doesn't he? Because he has, a couple of active roles with the HMS Coventry Association and SAMA 82, South Atlantic Medal Association 82.
This is his way of dealing with, he describes himself as having PTSD from this, and I think his way of dealing with it is to get involved and to make sure that nobody forgets the sacrifices made by the 255 that didn't come back, and particularly for his shipmates in HMS Coventry. So he is chairman of the HMS Coventry Association, and they meet annually on the 25th of May. So that's just gone, and it will be particularly poignant on this one because he's written a poem for it, which I haven't seen yet. But I look forward to reading it. And he's also a trustee of SAMA 82. This is the veterans charity for the South Atlantic Medal Association. And he's doing an awful lot of work for them. He just seems to get involved in everything. And everything he touches seems to come out well. He's a remarkable man.
Yes, indeed. I think it's worth mentioning for our listeners' benefit that if you're a holder of the South Atlantic Medal and any of the stories of this mini-series about the Falklands affects you, do get in touch with the South Atlantic Medal Association because they are there to help. Or even if it's just meet up with old comrades in arms. We'll put the link in the description below. So I would say, as we're recording this, Mike, I haven't told you, I popped down to the reunion on the 25th and recorded Chris reading his story, and we will play that out at the end of this episode.
Oh, I can't wait to hear that. I've met Chris once now, and I hope to meet him again soon. I just think this is what makes us great, is people like Chris Howe. It's how they deal with adversity and their resolve and determination and commitment and everything. This is why, that's why I was so proud to serve in the Royal Navy, because I was serving with people like him. I'm sort of welling up now thinking about it, but they are completely and utterly the reason why we have such a great Navy, such great armed forces. It's people like Chris Howe.
Well said, Mike. I don't think there's anything I could possibly add to that. As promised, here's Chris reading his poem at the HMS Coventry D118 reunion service.
As has been tradition in this service, and certainly since I've been chairman, I've always found a sailor's poem to add at this part of the service, which I find quite appropriate. In the first few years, I would plagiarise someone's poem to read. The last 3 years, I've actually written my own poem and read out of this service. And if anyone writes poetry, you realise it's certainly not the spoken word, it's certainly not the written word, it's something else from somewhere else that gives you those words. And it's from here about how I think about, and I know many of my shipmates think, because I hear the same things when we get together in gatherings such as this, and again in November in London. So I've written another poem. I had another one in me for the 40th anniversary, and this is to my shipmates still on patrol. 2 years since we fought that day. We survived till sunset that long day in May. The sun rose in the east as it always does, but calm seas, a fair wind, were not friends to us. Tested we were, again and again. Our defences stayed true, at watch we remained. Hours slipped by and sunset drew near. Warnings were read. No time to rest, must look to the west. Up goes a shout as the enemy closed. Bring weapons to bear, they must be opposed. Sadly for us, it was not to be. A final encounter for both you and me. The ultimate sacrifice was made that day. That's why we remember the 25th of May. Up spirits, lads. Thank you.
Hi, it's Mike here again. So just to let you know, this podcast accompanies the stunning Falklands 40th commemorative book produced by theveteran.uk on behalf of the South Atlantic Medal Association, SAMA 82. And we'd like to say a really big thank you to both our funders for making this possible, namely theveteran.uk and SAMA. And if you'd like to buy a copy of the book, then please head to either the veteran.uk website or sama82.org.uk. Thanks for listening.
Before we finish, we'd love to hear from you. So if you've got any thoughts, suggestions, or even a bit of banter, just email us at podcast@companyofmakers.com. You never know, you might even get a mention. And don't forget to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you. This podcast was produced by Rachel Owen, hosted by Mike Davis Marks, and me, recorded and edited by yours truly.
Company of Makers, podcast talks, workshops.